Thanks so much for coming here. So it's time to start our seminar. So this is the Nature Finance at Oxford seminar, which is a collaboration between the Nature Positive Hub and the Resilient Planet Finance lab, which is run by Dr. Nicola Ranger. So I'm today's host. I'm Sofus Tuamgasan, for the Nature Finance lead at the Nature Positive Hub. So today it's a huge pleasure to welcome Dr. Hannah Wauchope. Dr. Hannah Wauchope is a lecturer at the University of Edinburgh. She's here today to talk about biodiversity credits. And specifically, I really wanted to invite Hannah today because Hannah is basically one of the world's experts in understanding changes in species population trends. So this is the science of how we know whether or not conservation has actually worked. So Hannah's been doing, obviously, a bunch of theoretical and modeling work on detecting changes in species trends and real-world conservation impact evaluation. So that's using real data to work out if a conservation intervention has worked. Now, both of these sort of areas of conservation science are totally critical if we want a biodiversity credits system that has high levels of scientific integrity. So it's a great pleasure that I welcome Hannah to give this talk today.
Thank you, Sofus. Cool. Hi, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here today. I'm going to be talking about a paper that we recently published with the same title, What is a Unit of Nature? I won't have time to go into everything in the paper. You'll find the stuff that I'm referring to, and often I'm going to talk about studies that I won't reference, but you can find them in the paper. So basically, go there as your source for everything. And I need to open fresh by saying that the work I'm presenting was 100% a collaborative project between me, Sofus, Julia, Harrison, Henny, and EJ. This is a group project that I happen to be presenting, so I'm completely in debt of that team for making this work. So we're talking about units of nature and the biodiversity credit market. And I know that most people here will know what that is, but I'm just, for anybody that's not familiar, going to give a really brief overview. So biodiversity credits are defined as a certificate that is evidence of a unit of positive biodiversity outcome. I've spoken to some people who have this impression that biodiversity credits are companies buying land from other companies as a credit, and that's not the idea. What it is that if you buy a biodiversity credit, you're buying evidence of positive conservation outcomes. That's all you're buying. And biodiversity credits have become an increasing thing of increasing interest recently in the last couple of years. They've exploded in popularity. And the general concept is that there's private companies that are either buying land or working with landowners to do conservation outcomes, and they are selling those evidence of conservation outcomes as credits to other buyers. So that's the general setup. As a brief bit of history, this isn't a new idea. Biodiversity credits have existed in some form since the 70s. So they've existed more within the realm of biodiversity offsets. And this is this idea, as I'm sure we're all familiar, where a company is destroying biodiversity or habitat in one area and offsetting that by protecting or restoring it in another area. It was started in the States. It's now common worldwide. And often biodiversity credits are sold within biodiversity offsets markets. So they've been existing for a while, but generally within country-specific regulated markets. Not quite always, but most of the time. The difference now with this sudden explosion in biodiversity credits is that they're voluntary and international. So this market is going global. It's companies selling to anyone in the world, and it's not within a regulated framework from a government. It's at any scale. Biodiversity credits are also very similar, as I'm sure we all know, to carbon credits. Carbon credits emerged. They were also kicking around for quite a while in the late 1900s, but they emerged as a global phenomenon in 1997 after the Kyoto Protocol. And it's the same concept again of selling units of something, of evidence of something to someone else. With carbon credits, it was selling units of carbon dioxide that had either been prevented from being emitted into the atmosphere or sequestered from the atmosphere. And the voluntary market exists for carbon credits. There's a voluntary international market. But the key difference to this biodiversity credit market is that there's an agreed unit there, 1 ton of carbon dioxide. That is the standard. And with the acknowledgement that that is not always easy to measure, is at least there's an agreement in the market as to what 1 unit is. So today we're looking at biodiversity credits. And I'm going to be talking to you about what we think about with 1 unit of nature, and consider what that means for whether the market's going to work, because we know from biodiversity offsets and carbon credits that there have been major issues with those markets. And there are both philosophical and practical arguments for and against biodiversity credits. The philosophical ones, I don't have time to go into, so we're not going to think about that. Some people do not think that this is a good idea fundamentally for social or economic reasons. We're not thinking about that. This is happening, this market exists. So let's examine what's going on with it and understand what's actually being bought and sold when people work with biodiversity credits. So we're focusing on the kind of implementation issues. And when we think about those sorts of implementation issues in these previous iterations of credit markets, we know that there have been a lot of problems. So there have been multiple studies, including one led by Sophie sitting right here, looking at biodiversity offsetting and trying to understand whether that's actually producing positive outcomes for biodiversity. And these studies have shown that at least where we have data, which is in a lot of cases we don't, that schemes are not achieving no net loss. So the offset equation isn't balancing out. There is nature being destroyed that isn't being fully compensated for by nature being restored or conserved elsewhere. And we know from the carbon credit market, many of you, I'm sure, saw a couple of years ago, there was a huge expose in The Guardian that alongside a few other studies showed that the claims of carbon credit organizations were being exaggerated. So they were claiming that they were sequestering or preventing from being emitted more carbon than the truth. And in aggregate, that expose resulted in $1 billion being wiped off the carbon credit market overnight. So there is this huge imperative to be sure that when we're measuring something and making claims about evidence of measuring something, that those claims are actually accurate and that they're representative to ensure that our credits are representing what they claim. Oh, I've just said that, yeah. So all of those issues are mostly because of challenges in how we measure something. So there's this imperative then to understand in this new biodiversity credit, voluntary international biodiversity credit market, how are these credits being measured? And is it possible that we can overcome these challenges that have existed in these previous schemes? Now, I gave you this definition of a biodiversity credit before, but that was the short definition. Here's a full one from the Biodiversity Credit Alliance. The certificate that aims to represent a measured and evidence-based unit of positive biodiversity outcome that is additional to what otherwise would have occurred. And these are key points. So we're saying we need to prove that there has been conservation or restoration that has occurred. It's evidence-based, it's been measured. And those positive biodiversity outcomes need to have not happened otherwise. So the investment from the credit has to have caused those outcomes. And as I'm going to show you, these are really, really difficult things to do. So that brings me to the premise of this talk. What does that look like? What is a unit of positive biodiversity outcome? What is a unit of nature? What does that mean? So we did a review over the past year. We looked at these early movers in the biodiversity credit market. This space is moving fast. About 2-3 years ago, there were basically no companies that were looking at developing biodiversity credits in this way. There are now over 50. These are the companies that, as of August last year, had released full technical white papers explaining in detail how they define and calculate a unit of nature and how they do things like show that it's additional. These are the only ones that we were therefore able to review in detail. There are lots of other companies that we weren't able to review, but most of the big movers in the space are on this slide. And what I'm going to present to you now is a framework to understand the general idea of what a unit of nature is, what a biodiversity credit is, drawn from these early movers and trying to kind of pull out the major trends overriding what's going on. And I need to really emphasize the general, because basically everything I present here is not going to be accurate in every single way to every single operator. They are all variations on a theme. There's exceptions to rules. What I'm giving you is an overall framework so that you can conceptualize in general what's going on. And then if you're interested in a particular company and what they're doing, hopefully this framework gives you the ability to then go, oh, I see. So they haven't quite done that. They've done this. But that's much easier to pass when you have the big picture. If you're interested, our supplementary material for classifications of individual companies is with our paper. And I'll also direct interested people to this resource, bloomlabs.earth. It's a private company which is also providing really great syntheses of information on biodiversity credits. And they have a great table that gives kind of complementary detail, I think, to what our work has done. And I'm going to now walk us through this framework. And as I go along, I'm going to be highlighting the measurement challenges that I see with trying to develop this market, that we see with trying to develop this market. And they kind of fall into two broad buckets. Some of them are fundamental value conflicts about the way we conceptualize biodiversity and how we define its worth. And some of them are to do with actually how we measure things. And I'm going to argue that there are really deep uncertainties in how we measure this biodiversity. That's going to mean that there is a lot of uncertainty going on in our confidence around what credits represent. Cool. So our framework has 4 stages. The first one is very easy. It's framing. It's just, what is this credit about? Is it about any kind of biodiversity? Is it about a particular kind of biodiversity? Is it area-based, that kind of thing? Throughout this PowerPoint, please appreciate these dumb drawings I made in PowerPoint for the purpose of illustration. The next stage is quantifying. So this is how we assign value to biodiversity. So if you've got, say, a degraded savanna system, what are you measuring about it to know its value, to then show whether that value has changed through time? So it's just how are you quantifying the value of that ecosystem? The third stage is detecting, and this is kind of the crucial stage. So this is the stage where the company is detecting whether positive impacts have occurred. So through time, have they conserved or restored the ecosystem to be able to sell those credits? And the final stage is adjusting. And this is where we think about the kind of wider context into which the credits fit. And many companies are doing things like calculating from detecting overall how many credits they could sell, but then considering things like leakage or uncertainties or adding a risk buffer and reducing the final number of credits sold. So that's the overall framework. So the first stage, framing. This is just about what one credit represents. It's really fundamental stuff, but at least for me, before I started working on this, not being so familiar with biodiversity credits, some of these things you're like, oh, I just didn't realize these basic things. So generally, a biodiversity credit represents 1 hectare of land. Not always. There's some companies that are doing them on 3 by 3 meter squares. One of the organizations is representing a credit by individual trees, but almost always 1 hectare of land. Sometimes a company is defining it as it can be any biodiversity anywhere. Land or sea, doesn't matter. It's just a credit. It's just biodiversity. Others are more specific. There's some credits that are specific to tropical forests or to, say, just terrestrial biodiversity. And then the big kind of division in how credits are defined is whether they're representing conserved or restored biodiversity. So generally, credits are either saying this hectare of land has been conserved, so we've kept our nice savanna as a savanna, or it's been restored. So we've restored our savanna from a degradation to something better. And then there's a time frame that that credit represents, which is most commonly 1 year, but occasionally it's much shorter. So some credits represent 3-month periods. So each time you buy a credit, you're just representing 3 months of conservation that you've attained for that land. Cool, this is the easy stage. And there's only kind of one key challenge that we see in this kind of broad framing stage, and that's the question of fungibility. And fungibility is basically just this idea of whether something is interchangeable with something else. And I bring this up as a challenge, both because it's a key challenge in this part and also because it raises one of the biggest questions around how biodiversity credits are being proposed to be used. And that is, can they be used as offsets? Are credits just a chance for companies to buy credits to show that they're making a positive impact on biodiversity, or are they buying them to offset damage elsewhere? Because if you're buying a credit to offset damage elsewhere, that means that you're starting to say that damage to one ecosystem, maybe a savanna, is equal to conservation or restoration of a completely different ecosystem. And what we know about biodiversity is just that that's fundamentally not the case. This isn't like carbon, where 1 ton equals another ton. That's a really, really different question. And even if you restrain it, even if you say that the credits have to offset, say, forest with forest, one tropical forest in one country is very different to tropical forest in another country. And so if we're allowing credits to be used as offsets, this brings in problems. But it's not just that. Even if credits aren't allowed to be used as offsets, If we start defining one biodiversity credit as just any biodiversity anywhere, we lose the ability to be prioritizing biodiversity for the different reasons that we care about it. Sometimes we all care much more about a tropical forest in one region than a tropical forest in another region. And if we're just reducing it all to just credits, we lose that nuance, which some companies are attempting to address by tiering the price of their credits according to whether they're in high important biodiversity areas, but not all of them. All right, that was the easy step. Next, we move on to quantifying. It's these next two stages that are most interesting to me, I guess, as someone who's a specialist in quantifying things. So what are you actually measuring about an ecosystem when you define its worth? And this means that we need to ask, what is valuable about biodiversity? Why do we care about biodiversity? Because it can't just be that we care about more species or something, because in different ecosystems, that means different things. In a desert, there's not that many species, but it's still a valuable ecosystem. And it also means that we need to be thinking about the values that we can measure. So the way that countries are proposed, I'm saying a lot of weird words today. The way that companies are proposing to do this, there's kind of two separate approaches that are being taken. And the first is that you assign a continuous metric to your ecosystem. And most commonly, this means taking a basket of metrics approach where you're measuring multiple things about this ecosystem and bringing them together. So for example, you might measure the species richness of the site. For anybody that's not in the ecology world, that's literally just the number of different types of species that you have in an area. Then you might measure the abundance of a species of interest at your site, maybe giraffes. Maybe then you use satellite data to measure net primary productivity. And you take the average of your values and you say, I don't know, this ecosystem is worth 42. Great, lovely. We've quantified that ecosystem. We've given it a number. And most companies are in recognition of the fact that you will want different metrics in different areas, are calling it a basket of metrics because they're saying, depending on the project, depending on the region, you can choose different metrics to go into your basket to quantify your ecosystem. Other companies are taking a way simpler approach and they're just going for a binary condition. So they're basically classifying an ecosystem as good or bad, essentially, dependent on, for instance, whether an indicator species is present. So maybe you say, we think that jaguars can only exist in intact tropical rainforest. So if we see a jaguar, the rainforest must be okay. So it's like, no jaguar, meow, meow. A jaguar, great. we've said that the ecosystem is of good quality. Others are taking that same concept, but say with deforestation. So it's just, has your site been deforested? Yes or no. It's kind of this binary thing. And there's two challenges at this quantifying stage. One of them is another one of these more kind of fundamental philosophical challenges. And that is, why do we value biodiversity? Do we value it always for these specific metrics that we measure? And many people would argue that we don't. You might think about the forest that you loved when you were a child that you go to, and that for you is going to have way more value than another forest that might technically have more species or be a bit more structurally complex. The ways that humans interact with nature isn't this kind of very quantifiable transactional view all the time, and we're going to be missing some of these really core values when we're only thinking about quantifying biodiversity numerically. And that's a risk that we just have to think about when we're considering credits. They are not going to be capturing all the ways that biodiversity is valuable for us. And for those approaches that are taking the binary condition, you have even more concerns about whether that binary condition is truly representative of the value of an ecosystem. So say a credit is just like, a site is deforested, yes or no. That's giving us no information on whether there's hunting going on the site, whether there's pollution damaging the biodiversity in the site. We know that many indicator species can actually often function in quite degraded ecosystems. So it's not always going to be enough, that binary condition. And the other challenge in this quantifying stage is one that, this is, to me, one of the most interesting and kind of, I don't know, I'm going to be intrigued to see how this plays out. Aspects of quantifying biodiversity credits and what it means for selling credits, because it's quite a technical point that has huge consequences. So when we think about this basket of metrics approach, you're bringing together measurements that are on very different scales. So let's say we've got our savanna. I actually think that that's way too many species, but whatever, it doesn't matter. Let's say this savanna has 127 species. We've got 8 giraffes, and our net primary productivity is estimated at 2 tons of carbon. And now we need to bring that together into one value. How do you take the average of values that are measured on such different metrics, on such different scales? You can't just take the average of those numbers. That would be insane. That would mean that any change in species richness will just dwarf our average value. So you can't do that. What most operators are doing to deal with this problem is something called a distance to target scaling. And this is where they divide all of their values by an estimate of what the target ideal value would be for that ecosystem. So you say, we think in the savanna system, ideally you'd have 250 species. There would be 16 giraffes, and net primary productivity would be 7.5 tons. That way, we can change our numbers into a percentage. Species richness is halfway to what we want it to be, et cetera. And now we can take our average. Lovely. It seems sensible. It seems like a good idea. And I mean, I think it is a good idea. I don't have a better idea for how to do this, to be clear. But it's dangerous. And the reason for that is that these target values, we don't know those numbers from the majority of ecosystems. We don't know what ideal species richness should be. We don't know what the ideal abundance of giraffes should be. Sometimes we might know what net primary productivity is. Things that are satellite derived are often a bit easier to know, but still there's a lot of uncertainty there. And also, we don't even know whether there should be one ideal value. Many ecosystems are quite variable through time. So this means that there's going to be huge uncertainty bounds in how we estimate these target numbers. And we also need to estimate them for each individual project. So the amount of intellectual kind of time and process that goes into estimating these numbers is going to be huge. The consequences if we get it wrong are this. If you lowball your target value estimates, you're going to overestimate how many credits you can sell. Let me explain. So let's say we've decided that our target value for species richness for this ecosystem is 250. And let's say at the moment we have 50 species. I'm going to jump ahead to explain the next stage of detecting, which is where we go from having individual numbers for our ecosystem and look at them changing through time. We'll get to that in a minute, but that's the general approach. You see how in the future, how many more species you have after you've done your restoration, say. Let's say we go from 50 to 100 species in 5 years. That's a gain of 20% to 40% when we scale by 250. So we've gained a 20% gain, and often that means 20 credits are sold. However, if we drop our target number and have the exact same gain in the number of species, using this distance to target scaling, our percentage increase has grown, and we now have a 34% gain. Suddenly, we've got 34 credits that we could sell rather than 20 credits. That's quite a jump. And so I think there's a massive danger here that because there is so much uncertainty and unknowns around these target values, if they're underestimated, we're going to be overestimating and overselling the number of credits and overestimating the actual amount of biodiversity gain we've obtained. And I think that we need to think about just how much knowledge and regulation would be required to do that, and whether that's a smart and useful spend of funds that could otherwise be going to conservation itself. And I think, again, this is a challenge that is particularly an issue if we think about offsetting. So if you're overestimating the biodiversity gains and it's not to offset losses elsewhere, maybe that means that a company profits more than it should for biodiversity credits. Not great, but not awful. However, if we're using it to offset and our gains aren't matching the amount of damage we've done, that's a lot more dangerous. All right, that's the quantifying stage. Next, we have detecting. So this is where we're talking about, we figured out how we're going to measure our ecosystem. How do we now know whether it's been conserved or restored through time? So for conservation, it depends on whether we've got a continuous metric like we were just discussing, or this much more simple binary condition approach. Binary condition's super easy. Is your species there? Great, conservation has been achieved. Or has deforestation happened? No, conservation has been achieved. That's easy. And so for these companies, they're looking to track through time if we're continuing to meet that binary condition. Are we continuing to have a species present through time? Are we continuing to see no deforestation through time? For a continuous metric, it's a similar concept. Just this idea that maybe we have our biodiversity index metric at a certain value, and then we set up a little buffer to allow for some variation and say, provided that through time, our value stays within that buffer, we're saying conservation has been achieved. And so we can issue credits at the 5-year mark, say, and the 10-year mark to be selling our credits. If our value fell below the 10% buffer, conservation hasn't been achieved, credits can't be sold. Restoration, it's a similar concept. No companies are using a binary condition to do restoration credits. I think this is because it makes sense. Restoration is not a binary thing. A site's not either degraded or restored. It goes through a process, so it doesn't make sense to represent that in a binary way. So for a continuous metric for restoration, we're just measuring that site through time and looking at the percentage change in the metric through time. So maybe at year 5, we've seen a 42% increase from the baseline. At year 10, we've seen a 37% increase or something like that. So that's the kind of setup. Oh yeah, sorry. And then how many credits do you actually sell from that? So for restoration credits, most typically it's just whatever that percentage gain is multiplied by the number of hectares at your site. For conservation, generally it's a little bit more complex. So some companies are saying, all right, we'll sell 20 credits for every hectare we conserve, maybe adjusting that up or down depending on the value of the habitat or the threat level. But that's the general idea. And again, there's 2 challenges at this detecting stage. The first one was very pithily coined by Sophos. This is commodifying noise. And this is this idea that ecosystems aren't static things that only change in response to something like restoration. Ecosystems are really randomly variable. Numbers change through time. The abundance of species we're interested in changes through time naturally. With the weather, we might see changes in vegetation cover of a forest. There's just all this random variability that's going on. And if you're selling credits at the level of the percentage change, we're going to be often selling credits that don't actually represent true change that's been influenced by the project. So I've got some examples, for instance, for those, again, not familiar with ecological systems to know what this looks like. This is data on birds taken from the Christmas bird count, which is a great website, by the way. It's got tons of data on American just we can just see for just 4 random bird species that I picked, some of them don't change that much through time. Some of them are really, really variable through time. And so any metric that's going into your basket of metrics that's showing this natural variability that we see in ecosystems constantly is going to be commodifying noise. Will be either rewarding or penalizing projects for changes that have nothing to do with the project. It is worth saying that some operators are attempting to account for this. So they're looking at defining buffers if you have to have a change of X amount in order to for a credit to be issued. So like 1 or 2% changes don't count. But not all operators are doing this. And I think that's something that we really should be encouraging because we cannot be just rewarding straight numbers. And the other part is it's not just random variability, it's also measurement error. Really hard to measure things. I think there's a perception, even I notice within academics that aren't specifically in conservation and biodiversity science, perception that we know a lot more than we do about, say, how many individuals of an animal are in a location, let alone how many individuals of an animal are there across the world. We have no idea for so many of these metrics, we just don't know. And there is increasing technology allowing us to measure these things, but I'm worried about what a colleague of mine, I'm stealing this, someone used this phrase last week. I'm worried about tech washing in this sense. There are a lot of companies that are claiming to use new tech like eDNA, LiDAR, remote sensing, camera trapping methods, and saying that this solves the problems. We can just measure biodiversity perfectly now with this technology. And it's just not true. These technologies still have huge uncertainty bounds that go with them. The colleague that I stole this phrase from is actually working on a biodiversity credits project in South America on using tech like LiDAR and other such things. They are only able to use that tech because they have 5+ years of intensive field data from that specific site so that they can ground truth all the tech they're using and ensure that those numbers are representative. That's great for them. Most areas in the world, we don't have that level of ground truthing data and other things to be ensuring that that technology is telling us what we think it's telling us. So all this new tech is great. It doesn't solve this measurement error issue. And that introduces the same thing. You could go to a site that technically, in truth, has the same number of individuals of a species and get very different numbers year to year. Nothing to do with what's actually going on with the credit project. It's just noise. It's just stuff that we can't actually measure. And the other challenge within this stage is the kind of the big one. This is the one that a lot of people are talking about. And this is how credits are showing additionality. I.e., how do we know that conservation or restoration wouldn't have happened anyway? And this is what took down, that was probably a little strong. This is what caused that massive crash in the carbon market a couple of years ago. It was a couple of big academic studies that showed that carbon credit companies were overestimating the carbon. And actually, in many cases, the forests that they were claiming to have protected wouldn't have been cut down anyway. And it's crucial that we get this right. We need to be, otherwise, why are we investing money? If your site was going to be protected anyway, what was the point? So when we think, I think I've gone into too much detail with these figures. I think the concept isn't that hard. I'll go fast. So the idea is basically that, say, for a conservation credit, without it, in the future, we would expect that that credit has turned into a farm with a really shittily drawn cow. But with the credit, we've produced conservation. Cool, so that's the idea. Well, for a restoration, oh, sorry. Yeah, I've really over-egged the pudding here. Yeah, we all get it, okay. And then if without the credit, it was still gonna be a savanna, then why did we bother investing money? Doesn't matter. Same deal for restoration. We need to expect that without the credit, our savanna would have stayed degraded. But with the credit, we've produced a nice savanna. Cool, lovely. Why does this matter? It matters because of this thing called adverse selection. And this is basically this idea that actors are most likely to enroll in these sorts of schemes like biodiversity credits if they've got a low opportunity cost. So you might have a landowner that has a patch of forest sitting there. They were never planning to do anything with it anyway. It wasn't threatened. But they sign up to a credit scheme and start making money, which is lovely for the landowner, but not lovely for conservation, because we should be investing that money into somewhere where there was actual threat. So we need to be sure that we're proving additionality. And to do that, we need to be doing something that we call in the technical term world, estimating the counterfactual. And the counterfactual represents this kind of alternate reality future in which we didn't have a credit project. So we need to find some way of estimating if we could split our lives in two and have a second future, what would have happened if we didn't protect that site or if we didn't restore that site. Obviously, we can't actually see that. We have no ability to see two worlds at once, so we have to estimate the counterfactual. At the moment, credit companies are estimating the counterfactual either by just estimating the general threat level of the region or on project-specific evidence, like saying we thought this site was going to get affected. So they're basically saying, we think that there was high deforestation in the area, or we think that probably this site was going to be damaged. Those are very, very coarse metrics, and they're very, very hard to regulate and measure. And they're not great estimates of the counterfactual. And if we've learned anything from the carbon market and previous biodiversity offsetting schemes, we know that they're not a very good metric for actually representing how threatened your specific site was. Restoration projects are just assuming no natural regeneration. So what they're saying is, if you have a site that improves in biodiversity over time, the project has succeeded. What we know from reality is that very often, natural areas left to their own devices will regenerate and will restore. So that's not always going to be the case unless the restoration project has stopped continuing degradation of a site, say removed cows from a field and allowed it to naturally regenerate. That's not a great assumption. So how do we externally assess and regulate this? How do we ensure that these sites actually were threatened or actually have been restored? I don't have an answer for this. For the carbon market and for other previous assessments of biodiversity offsetting schemes, we've used satellite data. And so for these forest carbon schemes, when we use the satellite data, it's not always the case, so looking at me slightly surprised, but most often we use satellite data. And we were able to look at sites that were within carbon credit projects and similar forests nearby and see whether the forest nearby had been deforested as expected to show that the carbon credit project had stopped deforestation. And you can do that when you have satellite data because we have data through the years across the world. But most biodiversity credit projects are trying to measure which is great. They're trying to measure these really in-depth things about the ecosystem, things like species richness, things like species abundance. We can't get those numbers without going into the field and counting, and that is a huge amount of work that we can't do from satellite data. So it's going to be phenomenally difficult to regulate and externally know how well the biodiversity credit operators are doing at getting additional conservation or restoration gains. Cool. Last stage, adjusting. So this is to do with thinking about the wider context of the credit and adjusting for things outside project control. So this is issues around, say, leakage and permanence, which hopefully everybody's familiar with. And this is really simple. So say from your detecting stage, you calculate that you should issue 30 credits. You might subtract 5 for leakage, hold back 20% as a buffer to just account for general uncertainty. And so you sell 20 credits per hectare, say. Simple in theory, difficult in practice, again. In order to do that leakage bit where we subtract for leakage, we need to have an estimate of how much leakage has happened. Now, leakage can be divided into kind of two rough camps. There's direct leakage, and this is where we have a situation where within the kind of project area or nearby, leakage is happening. So for example, let's say a landowner has this lovely, beautiful farm here, and they have some grazing land, and they decide to convert that into forest to make money on biodiversity credits. But then, oh, well, maybe we'll cut down that forest and turn that into grazing land because we still need to produce cattle for making money. And so in the end, we've had no net gain in biodiversity. That's direct leakage. Some operators say that we need to be monitoring this by monitoring all biodiversity within the project site to ensure that landowners aren't doing things like this. But it gets tricky because sometimes you could be doing this kind of at the more regional scale, and that's not really monitored. But the other kind of leakage is very, very difficult to estimate, and this is market leakage. And this is where things get a little bit more complex. I've tried to make it simple with this fun diagram. So it's basically to do with the fact that if you're changing how land is used, you're affecting supply chains. So we can see the supply of beef through time and the price of beef through time up here. Let's say we've got a farm that's producing beef. It decides to restore that land, remove the cows, and make money. Instead of making money off beef, they're going to make money off biodiversity credits and restoring the land. That means that our supply of beef drops at a global level maybe, which drives the price of beef up, which means that farm 2, which might be in another country or another continent, sees that beef is now selling really well and decides it's worthwhile to change what was some forest into pasture land to sell meat, and then there's no net gain. This is a really tricky problem. It is discussed a lot in the literature. How on earth we're meant to calculate that is really difficult. Yeah, so direct leakage, we can measure the surrounding area. Market leakage, don't know. And many economists are of the opinion that unless your conservation or restoration action is going hand in hand with reducing demand for the commodity that you've stopped the land producing, or figuring out a way to produce that commodity more efficiently on less land, you're never actually going to be achieving anyway. We're just kind of shifting things around. And finally, there's this issue of permanence. And this is that we need to ensure that our gains are lasting through time. And most operators specify that projects must last for at least 20 years to try and account for this. But beyond the 20-year point, we don't know. And this is again where the issue of offsetting comes up. Because if you have destroyed a rainforest and bought a credit, but then the rainforest in your credit is also destroyed after 20 years because the project ends, we've had a total net loss of biodiversity. Cool. So that's the general setup of biodiversity credits. And I hope I brought to your attention a number of really fundamental challenges that we're facing along the way with this process. Some of them, like fungibility and how we quantify nature's value, are really fundamental issues about how we think about biodiversity and why we care about it as human beings. And some of them are deep uncertainties in the way that we quantify biodiversity. And I think that what all of this takes us to is the fact that if biodiversity credits are allowed to be used as offsets, it is highly likely that they are not going to be great for biodiversity. And this isn't a new take. Many biodiversity operators and institutions are already calling for biodiversity credits to not be used as offsets. But there are also actors that are talking about this as an idea. So for example, the International Advisory Panel on Biodiversity Credits does specify offsets as a use case. But the thing is, there are just so many ways in which we are going to be uncertain about the biodiversity gains from biodiversity credits, which means that we're trading certain destruction of nature for a very uncertain gain in nature. It isn't to say there won't sometimes be positive gains, but we just can't be confident about it all the time. And that uncertain gain might even be of a completely different ecosystem to the one that we destroyed, which brings in all those values issues. However, if biodiversity credits are used as a means of businesses, say, demonstrating that they're contributing to positive biodiversity outcomes, without that positive contribution being allowed to mask or offset their negative impacts, then there's some possibility. So we argue that credits must not be used to offset or mask negative impacts. Businesses still need to be observing the mitigation hierarchy strictly. We need to be ensuring there's really strict regulation to be reducing and where possible, halting biodiversity harms from businesses. And they cannot mask those harms by purchasing credits. It needs to be two separate things. We also need to be making sure that credits are respecting the decision-making power of Indigenous and local peoples. We know there have already been lots of issues in the carbon market with land grabs in the global south and human rights abuses from companies trying to acquire land to sell carbon credits. And it's crucial. And there are some great initiatives underway to ensure that this doesn't happen, but that needs to keep going. And finally, we need to ensure that credits are not a substitute for public policy and investment in nature. As we've seen, they miss a lot of the core reasons why we value biodiversity as human beings. They are one part of the puzzle. If you even philosophically agree that that's a good idea, they are not everything. And that is all I have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Hannah. That's just such a good talk. So good. So yeah, we got about 15 minutes for questions. We'll start with a few from the audience here, and then I think there's quite a few online as well. So are there any from the audience? Yes, please.
Can you speak to this for the online audience as well? Thanks. I guess my question is quite a general one, which is how stable are the structures that are keeping credits as a market up in the first place?
Ooh.
Yeah.
So you know what? I should say, Sophus, I'm going to ask for you to make this a team question answering session. So as I said, this was a group project. I brought in the conservation knowledge. I think you were a much better place to answer that question. Did you catch it?
Yeah. I think it is too early. We don't know yet. So in terms of these sort of pure non-compensatory voluntary international credits, we're only talking about a couple of $1 million that have transacted. So as in there is, the really hard thing about studying biodiversity finance is that most of it doesn't exist yet, right? And it's based on hypotheticals or conjecture or projections. And so who these early movers are, is not necessarily a great predictor of who's going to win in the competitive battle. So it basically is too early to say.
Here, hang on. If I give you one of these, does that work, or are they doing physical? Okay.
Thank you so much. That was a really great talk, and I also really like the review. I was just wondering, just given like the amount of issues with the biodiversity credit system right now, if in your review you also saw other alternatives to having financial flows for protecting biodiversity and what they might be.
So that was other financial flows for protecting biodiversity. It's a really tricky question. So this is not, biodiversity credits and offsetting markets are not the first iteration of attempts to bring financial flows into conservation. So payments for ecosystem services is quite a common market tool in which people are paid on their land to promote ecosystem services. I don't have an idea for a magic solution that fixes this. I think it's just fundamentally very, very difficult to figure out how to make something that is essentially a public good like biodiversity and commodify it. Yeah, I don't have I've critiqued a lot what biodiversity credit operators are doing. I don't have a better idea, but that doesn't mean it's not potentially harmful. don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, so a really good resource for this is the UNEP State of Finance for Nature report from 2023. So that outlines basically all of the different financial flows that are going into harming biodiversity and those that are going into conserving biodiversity. Historically, well over 80% of all biodiversity conservation funding comes from the state, public goods, the public provision of public goods. And then I think anyone who works in the biodiversity finance space recognizes that by far the best thing that you can do for biodiversity finance is to rewire the unbelievably large damaging subsidies that go into, which is public finance, that go into activities that actively erode nature. So subsidy reform is the #1 public policy or biodiversity finance priority. There's no doubt. And then the other one that there's increasing attention to, Nicola's group here is one of the ones that's at the forefront globally, is on shutting down profitable forms of private finance that derive revenues from destroying nature. So that's financial regulations that actively disincentivize or ban the ability to make a lot of money from deforestation, which currently is, there are some regulatory frameworks to try and disincentivize this, but many major Western banks still finance activities that cause deforestation because it's profitable. And that has to go, that has to stop in the future.
Thanks, Hannah. It was brilliant. By the by, it's basically the same set of issues in the way that companies are measuring their impact on nature, which is quite an interesting little mirror there. Just to help me think through this in terms of the framing nature part, because I thought it was really interesting. Say we solve all the quantification parts. We've just got variance on that. You and I share a view on nature, say. So you sell something to me, I bought it, it's good. Sophos might have a different view on how nature is framed.
Sure.
Does he have a sort of right to kind of criticize that interaction? And if so, how should we think about this? Is it something we need to sort out in a political forum, or how do we solve this issue if it is indeed an issue in the first place?
Okay, so is the drive for that question if two parties have agreed on how they value nature, what goes on between them is up to them? I think it does, because, well, it depends how you view ownership of nature. But unless you subscribe to a view in which, nobody has any right to care about land that they don't own, which I don't think is a fair view, then what happens with the biodiversity across the globe is of interest to all of us. And just because two parties agree in a particular way of valuing it doesn't mean that they necessarily should have a say over that. I think there's a huge risk of power imbalances there, particularly with things like the land grabs in the global south to do with some of these projects. The company that has bought that land may now have a view about how they value it, and you as a purchaser in the UK may have a view about how you value that. That might be very, very different to the view of the local indigenous people that live in that land have about that, but because they don't financially own the land, I don't think their voices should be excluded just because they're not. It's their country. It's often their way of life that another power has taken over. And I absolutely think that there should be, that shouldn't be something that we just leave up to the exchanging parties, I think would be my view on that.
Yeah, really good. So I see two components to your question. The first one is, so if the voluntary transaction between a buyer and a seller imposes some kinds of costs onto a third party, if it delivers a version of nature that is either contradictory to somebody's, then this is a classic externality problem, right? Then that is a consideration and that is a concern, right? Because then you have essentially actors with economic power determining decisions that potentially preclude the different conceptualizations of nature of local people. But that's kind of a theoretical issue. It's a really interesting thing. I mean, one of the reasons that I kind of generally believe that biodiversity finance is kind of socially unstable, right, is exactly because of this. Is because I don't think that fungibility is ever something that can be solved scientifically, right? And I think that it hinges on social value judgments that are irreconcilable, that will persist forever. I don't think that we will ever be able to sit and the market will run away with a single standardized measure, because it will forever remain socially contested, because that's not in any way a reflection of humanity's nature with the environment. So that means that, yeah, I don't see a form of stability for commodification in the way that I do for other kind of commodities. Yeah.
I'm also going to say, and I know this was the interesting premise for your question, so it's fine, but I don't see a world in which we ever solve a lot of these measurement challenges. Yeah.
Steve.
And then there's a question back there.
I would like to go on. There's a lot online.
Okay.
So can we go free online first? Is that right?
I'm going to just some of the ones that I got. Do you want to pick a few?
Okay, randomly.
There was a cool one up there about elephants.
These are all upvoted. So.
Okay, let's start with this. How can we measure credits for migratory species which are also endangered, such as elephants? Take, for example, elephants in the Kavango-Zambezi Transfrontier Conservation Area.
Oof. So we need Harrison here to answer this question. So in the biodiversity credit space, almost exclusively people are looking at it from an area-based perspective. So you're not protecting a species like elephants, you're protecting a block of land, except for some that look at trees, but they're a bit separate. However, there are other financial mechanisms going on, for instance, the rhino bond with the World Bank. And I wish, that, as I say, it's a group project. Harrison, who's part of the author team, knows a lot about how rhino bond works. That essentially, it's a financial mechanism in which investors get a financial return for population increases in rhinos. And so that might be an option for elephants also. And it is basically, it's a way of funding the conservation of rhinos that also gets returns to investors. But I don't know what your thoughts are on that, or should we jump to another one?
Yeah, it's a complex question. I'm not qualified. Next one. So what are some of the approaches for doing the counterfactuals with biodiversity?
Yeah, great question. So that is easy to answer in the theoretical, in that to do good counterfactuals, what you need to have is your area, say where your credit project is happening, and another area that's similar, it's a similar habitat, it's a similar biodiversity type, and it could feasibly have been designated as a credit project, but wasn't. And then you go in and you measure the same thing. So you measure the species richness, you measure the population abundance at that site. And then you track those two areas through time and see whether your unproject protected site has worse biodiversity outcomes than the project site. Great, lovely in theory. In practice, finding those sites, one, is challenging. The funding to monitor all those sites would be phenomenal. And the regulation to ensure that all of that had been done well is also really difficult. So it's something that's possible in the theoretical realm, but technically it would be really difficult. It would require a huge amount of investment and a huge amount of regulation. And then the question is that really the smartest way to be spending our resources? Like, we need so much money to be pumped into conservation. I don't know whether validating biodiversity credits to such a high degree is a smart way of spending that. And there's also a lot of issues around land rights with a credit. Are we then expecting like any credit company to buy double the amount of land they need and just use half of the counterfactuals? Or are they going to be going and monitoring biodiversity on land they don't own? It gets really complex. It's just hard. It's a really hard thing to do. I think we have to take some. Synthetic controls, sure, but synthetic controls still need a lot of data. You don't necessarily need your exact.
So if the point is to actually do it at a cost-effective level, there's no need to reinvent the wheel if other disciplines have been working on this for projects.
I completely agree. Synthetic controls will require a lot of data that we still don't have for biodiversity. That's the issue. We don't have that data to form a synthetic control. Exactly, that's the point. Exactly, that's the point. Yeah.
So there's one comment and then the last online question before we move back to the audience. So comment is a huge amount of effort needed to monitor. So this is somebody who's trying to develop, trying to capture the costs of monitoring in their sites. But it turns out that the cost of monitoring could take up a really big percentage of the credit revenues. So that's interesting,
absolutely.
right?
Yeah, that's the issue.
It's a wider transaction cost issue.
Yeah.
And then the last online question for today, and there's many more that we won't get to. If voluntary credits are not to be used for offsets, then who does that cut out in terms of buyers, and how does that relate to the GBF targets?
I think you can answer the first half of that. I'm just going to say that in terms of GBF targets, the goal of the Global Biodiversity Framework is to halt and reverse biodiversity loss. If there is a huge risk that by allowing credits to be used as offsets, they are resulting in still a net loss in biodiversity, we are absolutely not moving towards GBF targets by allowing them to be used as offsets. As to what that means in terms of buyers.
Yeah, no, I mean, my suspicion is that potentially does rule out a lot of potential buyers. I think the fundamental demand for biodiversity credits comes from the ability to make a claim. A claim to, say, nature positive, equivalent to kind of the claim to achieving net zero. That was a fundamental driver of the demand in the carbon credit markets. So yeah, I don't know the answer to this question. Somewhere in the trade-off between sort of rigor and the stringency of claims and the volume of finance flowing into biodiversity credits, there is an optimum. I have absolutely no idea where that optimum is, or even if the optimum lies at the extremes. So, I mean, but this is a huge area of further research. Yeah, I definitely don't have a clear idea of where that optimum is. Okay, so last two questions from the audience. There was one here. Yes. Yeah.
And then behind us had a hand up for a minute.
Thanks so much. My question kind of relates to that last question. Sort of whose responsibility do you see it as to make sure that it's not being used for offsets? Is it the actual companies providing the credit saying they won't sell to them? Is it public policy to come in? Is it the companies themselves? Just kind of wondering from a governance perspective. Or in your review, did you see any of these companies doing biodiversity offsets saying we will not sell them, or no, not credits saying we will not sell them for offsets?
Yeah. Yes, so some credit companies are absolutely saying that you cannot buy our credits to use for offsets. There are a couple of big kind of independent organizations that are setting themselves up as standard setters for the market. And the idea is that companies would subscribe to those standard setters and then obey their rules. Some of them are saying no offsets. Some of them are saying maybe offsets. Ultimately, it comes down from the market itself to regulate itself because it's international. It doesn't fit within a policy framework unless, I mean, now I'm in your territory again now, unless individual countries start regulating how businesses within those countries engage with the international market, which I don't know whether that's the thing. Or, well, I guess carbon credits, they just agreed in Azerbaijan last year to regulating that more at the international level. I don't think we know what that looks like. At least I don't know because I'm not a carbon specialist. Maybe that's something that could happen. I don't know. Outside my knowledge base now.
Yeah, so I'm actually very fascinated by what you say. How does biodiversity credits gonna do no harm? Make sure that's in the right direction. And there was this illustration you're talking about. If they cut down the ideal species diversity, and they can argue that they have a lot of increase in there. And it just occurs to me, is it a time to think about for each ecosystem sites? Now is the time to establish this. This is a reasonable amount of ideal diversity, and then we can measure all the credits. Is that from the wrong direction to think about that? And the other thing I was sort of like following the previous questions, like if the credits not for useful offset, is there still gonna be a market that have a lot of demand?
To your first question, in theory, yes, that would be great if we could set up what these values are for all ecosystems. Again, it's I think there's a huge public overestimation in how much ecologists know about ecosystems. I think to get that data for different ecosystems all across it's not possible. It's an insane proposition. It's not something that we could do. We can make big estimates, but with huge uncertainty ranges, and then you get into the issue again of, you know, where do you put your estimate within that range? To get to an exact number, the amount of effort phenomenal, but also the number doesn't exist, especially not in the world we live in with climate change. Ecosystems are changing fast. That number it's a shifting baseline. That number is going to be constantly changing as the ecosystem changes. Like biodiversity is phenomenally complex, and ultimately it can't be reduced to a single number. What's being done here is a way to abstract it. It's never going to be correct. So the question is, are we abstracting it in a way that's not harmful? And that's the challenge. As to whether there's a market without offsets.
Yeah, that was sort of the previous question.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, our time is up. I had such a good time. It was such a good event. Thanks so much to the Leverhulme Centre for hosting today, along with the Resilient Planet Finance Hub. Thank you so much, Dr. Hannah Wauchope. It's been an amazing talk.
Thanks, everybody.